very much for joining us. This is the second meeting of the Government Analytics Breakfast Forum. I'm Jennifer Bachner. I direct the Master of Science in Government Analytics here at Johns Hopkins. This is a relatively new master's degree program, and the purpose is to provide students with quantitative analysis skills so that they can be a leader in this new move toward data-driven decision-making in the public sector. We partnered with REI Systems to offer this breakfast series because we wanted to bring together professionals in academia and government and industry to discuss the various ways in which public sector organizations are using analytics to improve their governance and their policy making. So again, we really appreciate you taking time out of your, what I'm sure are very busy days to join us, and we look forward to your comments and insights. And I will turn the program over to Jeff Myers of REI Systems to present our distinguished speaker.
I forgot about this.
Oh yes, we have a mic this time.
Yeah. Hi, thank you all for coming. I also want to say thank you and welcome to the folks who are joining us via live web stream. And one caveat about that, because I'll probably forget otherwise, there will be an opportunity this time to ask questions on the web stream. If you're at the home page where you clicked to be able to see the video of this, there's a link at the bottom of that to submit questions during the course of that, and we'll get them on email here and relay them to Chantel as we go along. Let me describe first, though, briefly about the purpose of this breakfast, and it is really to advance a community around government analytics and to help create a community that includes not only academia and government, the private sector as well, and to stoke conversations. There tend to be a lot of conversations around big data and around technology, and actually some of the focuses of these are more about kind of practices within government and folks who've been very successful and how they use analytics and some lessons that they may have to offer you and an opportunity for you to ask them questions or to pose challenges that you may face to be able to see what sorts of advice they may have. So it's really intended to be a discussion. I'll leave it up to Chantel as to whether or not she'd like to have questions during the presentation or wait until after them. But let me also just briefly introduce REI. REI Systems is a company that has been around for about 25 years and provides technology related to analytics and services as well. You may not have heard, but recently we helped the Food and Drug Administration launch the FDA data dashboard. In that case, as opposed to many of the clients we work with, the clients decided to expose their data and their analytics to the public instead of just for internal use. And it's very interesting because they're using those analytics and that data to help kind of extend their capability for regulatory compliance. So they're extending their mission capability by introducing analytic information to the both drug manufacturers and the consumer public. Let me also, though, emphasize the couple of things that are upcoming analytics sessions. On February 11th, we will have David Bray, who's the Chief Information Officer for the Federal Communications Commission, and he's going to be talking about how the FCC has managed 2 million separate pieces of public input on net neutrality. So it's kind of how to do the analysis of unstructured data and masses of it, figure out what's spam and what's not, in case those of you who are interested in trying to think about analyzing data that's already out there or capturing data anew as the FCC has done. Then they're every other month on a Wednesday, so the next session after that will be on April 8th, and that will feature some folks from the Department of Homeland Security, and they'll be talking about essentially how it is you persuade the owners of data to share it with you so you can do the analysis within a government agency, which is occasionally a challenge because often the data resides in a variety of different places. People are nervous about whether or not it may be misunderstood or misinterpreted, and so they'll have some real-world discussions about how they've persuaded folks to share data within the DHS context. But let me, without further ado, introduce Chantel Wong, who is both a long-term friend of mine and also a very accomplished government civil servant. She has spent most recently several years as the Vice President for Finance and Administration at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, including service in that role as the CFO, and has had responsibility there for performance measures and data analytics. Those of you who aren't familiar, the Millennium Challenge Corporation is part of the U.S. government that makes foreign aid decisions and administers foreign aid on a merit basis. Countries that achieve certain sorts of, or meet certain sorts of criteria that are verified using data are eligible for foreign assistance programs and packages, as opposed to those decisions that may be made on a political basis elsewhere. Former her work with MCC, where she retired about 2 months ago. Chantel has been a senior executive with the Department of the Interior, with NASA, and has also served as a senior advisor to the administrator of the Office of Management and Budget, Alice Rivlin at OMB. Chantel is going to be heading in the new year towards the AMITA technology, where she'll have responsibility for data and open data, primarily and heavily in an international and a development arena. Chantel has a master's degree in public administration from Harvard University, and her long and checkered career includes a bachelor's degree in civil engineering, where she focused on sewers. She also worked at the Asian Development Bank on safe water and health and sanitation standards as the U.S. representative of the Asian Development Bank. So with that all in mind, what I asked Chantel here to do, not always necessarily that people do exactly what I asked them to do, but I asked her to talk a little bit about essentially kind of data-driven foreign aid decisions, where essentially in the United States, many decisions around budgeting have to do with increments. Do we give you a little more money or a little less money? And do we use some data to figure out where and which and how much more or less? Actually, in Chantel's case, it's an all or nothing sort of a deal. With the Millennium Challenge Corporation, if the data provides evidence that the country warrants the aid package, they get it, and if not, they don't. So it's kind of high stakes, data analysis-driven budgeting, as it were, and it kind of parallels in my mind to a certain extent some of the competitive grant programs that go on in the U.S. federal government and the civilian space here in the United States. So with all that, Chantel, thank you for joining us, and take it away.
Thank you. I should speak through this. Maybe we'll put it on here. I want to make it very informal, so stop me if you need clarification or answer any questions in the process. So it's good to see everybody. I've been bedridden for the last 4 days because I just had shoulder surgery, and Jeff knows I had a nerve blocker in my neck. It's really phenomenal that technology. In medical technology, they put a nerve blocker and it blocks all the pain for 4 days, but then it impacted my voice. I had a very high-pitched voice over the weekend, and Jeff heard me. I said, I hope I will get my voice back. By golly, I did today. So, yesterday, I got it last night, so I got my voice back. Anyway, I wanted to talk a little bit about, as Jeff mentioned, I spent the last 3 years at the Millennium Challenge Corporation. So I'm speaking not as an official from MCC, but as someone that just left. And I've been very active when I was at MCC to push data out into the open. It was an incredible experience that they use a lot of data analytics to make decisions, and I will go through sort of the internal process how they do that. But because of all that volume of data that is being used to make decisions, I spent a lot of my effort when I was at MCC to open up all that data. So we have I should say they now, because it's not we anymore. I need to learn to change pronouns. They have an open data portal that you can download all the data that it uses for analytics, for decision making, data.mcc.gov. And some of you heard me at the data transparency session to talk about how the open data journey happened. But today I want to talk about the use of evidence and evaluation at MCC. Let's see if I could get this thing to work. Well, let's see. Let's see. So MCC uses a lot of evidence in its programming, not only just what Jeff said in terms of decisions, whether it's a go, no go, whether a country gets money or not get money, but throughout the life cycle of the programming, there's a lot of data and data analytics.
Double check the mic to make sure it's on.
Can you hear me?
When you're ready for that.
Okay, can you hear me now? Yeah, better? Okay, so anyway, throughout the life cycle, in both in country selection, which is what Jeff mentioned in the introductory remarks, but also investment decisions, programming and monitoring, as well as independent evaluation, not only for accountability, whether we've hit the mark, what we say we're going to do with our programming, with the dollars that we're going to spend, but also for lessons learned. So some sort of a feedback loop to make sure that the investments that we're making, are they making the impact that we say we're going to make? So first on the selection, and this is really the key that most people think about MCC, is the scorecard, country selection. We use third-party data and a lot of data. And a lot of data from, not generated by MCC, but by others, by Transparency International, by the World Bank, by the IFC, WHO. A lot of other people make and generate this data, collect this data, and we use it, we analyze it, and we put it into a scorecard, what we call, and every year there is a process to determine which country will meet the scorecard, the country selection. And in fact, today is a board meeting. Secretary Kerry, the Secretary of State, is the chair of MCC's board, along with Secretary of Treasury, USAID Administrator, USTR, head of USTR, and our CEO makes up the 5 public sector board members. There's a meeting, usually in the Secretary Kerry's little conference room. They're going to go over the 2015 selection of which countries are eligible for MCC funding. At the end of this process, they are eligible for a large chunk of money, and it's a grant dollar. So it's usually, it goes anywhere from, sometimes, the small is like 66 million, but it could go up to 700 million. And so many of the countries look at this, and it's a big, as Jeff said, it's very high stakes, huge dollars that are involved in this, and it's quote unquote somewhat free, because it's not, you don't have to pay it back to the bank or any of these institutions. It's a grant funding. So what we do is you should go on the MCC website and take a look at the 2015 scorecard that just got published within the last month, maybe the last few weeks. Uh-oh. I guess I should be touching this screen more often. Hang on. It's not coming back again. Maybe I when I plugged and unplugged it, it worked. Oh.
Click on it's behind underneath.
There it goes. Okay. So the selection process is 20 third-party indicators, they fall into 3 buckets. It is really ruling justly, so it's democratic governance, whether the country's been democratic elected. We don't go with any country that has not been democratically elected. So the democratic governance, that's political rights, whether the people in the country have the right to vote. It also focuses on investing in its people, whether the government invests in primary education, not just primary education, but what are the graduation rates for girls, for example, in that country. It also focuses on economic freedom. So how easy is it to do business, for example, in the country. So we use IFC data. IFC has us doing business in these countries. So in these buckets, they have to pass 10 of the 20 indicators. and they have to be green. So if we look at the country like Chad, you have to pass 10 of the 20. You have to pass a hard hurdle of control of corruption and a hard hurdle of democratic rights. So if you look at a country like Chad, it's all red. It looks like it's only, they have fiscal policy and the control of their inflation. So this country will not be eligible. On the other hand, if you look at Ghana, it passed more than 10 of the indicators, and it's passed the control of corruption and democratic rights. Now, control of corruption is a very interesting indicator because it is very, these are hard, sometimes maybe subjective data that is being used. A lot of it is in country is surveys, perceptions, particularly on control of corruption. Have you, like questions like, have you been asked to pay a bribe to get anything done? So this data, if you could take a look at them, it's very interesting. I looked at it 1 year. All the countries are really hovering over the same line. Most of them, and any one big case in a country, whether they either found somebody, a government corruption official, like it became a big splash news article, or they arrested somebody, that could sway that control of corruption indicator in a big way. So that's the one that, because it's a hard hurdle, you have to pass that. That's the one that is causing a lot of angst in a lot of countries, concerns about this. So once a country's been deemed eligible, the board today, for example, will make the 2015 decision. They decide which countries are eligible. They vote on it, and then we start doing what we call a compact development. These are the investment decisions that comes along. So I'll go through each one of this. First of all, what we do is what we call a constraints analysis. The mission of the agency is about economic growth in the country. So the constraints analysis we do is a macro, and we look at the macro and the micro economy of that country. What are the binding constraints? The question is, what are the binding constraints to economic growth in that country? Is it health? Is it education? Is it infrastructure? By and large, mostly is infrastructure in Africa, for example. They don't have roads, they don't have schools, they don't have water, sanitation, agriculture, any of those. So what we try to do is develop this thing called the constraints analysis, and the constraints analysis is developed with the country. Mostly, this is asking the country to do this analytics, by the way. And a lot of the times, there's capacity issues with the countries, but we try to very much get the countries to do this analytics, working with partners in the countries. And this is a process, by the way. It's not academics sitting back inside the office doing this. They have to have civil society as part of this conversation to be able to, people get together and agree that, wow, we think we need roads, we need railroads, or we need highways, or whatever it is. So that identifies within the country the constraints to economic growth. Along with this constraints analysis, there are other two pieces of analysis that gets done. One is because we believe, and rightly so, that government assistance or government aid going into a country is only a drop in the bucket. There's no way we could get enough money on the public sector side. We think in many of these countries, private sector-led growth is the key to economic growth. So we do another piece. We look at opportunities for investments, private sector investments. We call it an IOP, Investment Opportunities Program. That's an analysis that gets done also along with the business community within the country, the private sector, and civil society to figure out what those opportunities are. The other analysis that gets done is a gender analysis, because in many of these countries we recognize, and certainly development, we recognize that if you focus on gender, mostly many development does not focus on gender, but if you focus on gender, that actually gives you more sustainable development, economic development in a country. So there's a huge effort in gender in the economy. We need to understand how women are either contributing or not being allowed to contribute within that community or within that country. And there's a huge effort and analysis that goes on with. So with these three pieces of evidence and analysis, then we decide with the country what are the sectors to focus on. So I've got the example here we did for El Salvador. El Salvador, we found out it was in the tradables. They had issues with private sector growth in trading. And they also had infrastructure problems. So in El Salvador, we've structured a compact that is focused on building some roads. There are feeder roads, there are connector roads for trading, as well as focusing on their private sector efforts and pushing them very hard before we actually sign a compact for them to pass a PPP law, for example, a private sector partnership, public-private partnership law that encourages the country to get more into the private sector efforts. By the way, most of the countries are very much public sector led in these countries, right? So second thing we do, once we decide what the sectors are, we walk through what we call a program logic. What is the theory of change? If you want to have improvements in income levels to the farmers in Honduras, in this in the sector of growing, I don't know, cotton or whatever it is that you say, what inputs do you need up front? So we walk through from input to output to intermediate outcome, and most organizations stop at intermediate outcomes, but we have to go through to long-term outcomes as well as an impact. Did we actually improve the lives of these people by measuring their income, not only in for example, farmers' income, but we want to look at household income, because it is, sometimes a farmer, he may be improving himself, but maybe the whole household does not get improved. So we look at all the way to the impact, and we do. It is one of the largest portfolio of impact evaluation that I've seen, and these impact evaluations are very expensive. They're household survey impact evaluations, probably about $1 to $2 million a pop. Impact evaluation. It probably about 120. So MCC's been in existence for about 10 years. There's about 120 impact evaluations that are done or ongoing. It's quite phenomenal. By the way, as part of that open data process, we've been pushing out all the metadata as well as the microdata onto the data.mcc.gov. You'll be able to download many of these. I'll talk a little bit about the impact evaluation towards the end here. So then we focus on a cost-benefit analysis. By the way, we've got the economists are real happy with what we do, because this is real world stuff, right? We estimate an expected increase in household income, as I mentioned, for each of the proposed project. And it really is a big, high hurdle. We don't go and invest in any project unless it is, we've done a cost-benefit analysis and what we call a economic rate of return. Economic rate of return has to be 10% or higher before MCC will invest. So there's a lot of economic modeling, a lot of analytics around understanding your beneficiary stream, understanding what the costs are to those to that investment, and then doing a ERR. As a member of the, so we have a huge process. There is a investment management committee within MCC that makes up of all the VPs. So I sat on the investment management committee along with our chief economist, our chief of staff. So there's about 9 members of the investment management committee that looks at each one of these projects and to ensure that we have the right economic rate of return before we make a decision, and we recommend to the CEO whether it's a go or no-go for the particular project. Stop me if you want to have a discussion about any of this, right? So the country, as you see here on the slide here, the country actually creates the ERR. We don't do. We try to get the countries to do most of this work. By the way, MCC is only 10 years old, but it's only 300 FTE. It's a very small agency. We're focused on getting the capacity to be built at the country level. So we hold their hands through this process, but most of it is really done by economists that the countries hire. But we review and validate these assumptions. And then we do a beneficiary analysis. What groups I mentioned about gender is very, very critical for us to look at women and how the disparity occurs or not occur when we do these analysis. So it's a very in-depth. So these are investment decisions. As you can see, can you see from where you are? By the way, this Prezi is sent out to everybody on a link.
We'll have a link to it on the website.
You can definitely take a look at it. But it's 20-year ERR, 21%. This is education project, expanding access to tertiary finance. We expect that the household will increase, household income in year 20 will increase by 10%. Individual beneficiaries will improve. So a lot of analysis, you know, those of you that are interested in analytics, you know, this is, you love this stuff. So we look at results. Not only do we look at the inputs going into the investment, but coming out of it, what are the results? So I mentioned, we talked about El Salvador, for example. In order for us to sign a compact, we say you have to pass the PPP law. There's a lot of policy reform that goes on even prior to a dollar going over to the countries. Yes?
Just to go back on the education, what is the sort of bottom line, the literacy rates in these countries, or
Income.
Even in
I said
education?
economic growth.
girls' education you mentioned?
Yeah. So that's all. We conjecture that all of those analytics will feed to the ultimate goal of improving the income, household income. So we're very focused on household income. The education.
That direct link, and you don't-
There's no direct link, but we believe there's models. For example, in cars, when you build a road, there's a model that the World Bank has developed, HDMI model, for example, that shows based on roughness, based on a lot of inputs, what the what we think is going to be an increase in either traffic count, or so that is a proxy for economic activity, right? If you have increased road, increase economic, increased cars or trucks. So those are all modeling that I guess the economists know. I'm not the economist. Many of you, yes.
How does MCC ensure it's not getting, let's say, more favorable data that would favor the country versus making sure you have good data integrity in the process?
Yeah. So that's a good question, because we rely very much on third-party data. The independent evaluation, for example, is done by independent evaluators. Actually, what you brought up is very important, because many countries that we go into is very much a data dark.
Right.
Data dark, especially in Africa. There's not much data. So we spend a lot of time actually working with institutions in the country or outside the country, or with the World Bank, or with all kind of third parties involved in collecting this data, validating this data. Going into Liberia, for example. Liberia is a challenge now because of Ebola. Liberia and Sierra Leone both are countries that MCC's board selected to go into. Liberia, as we were doing a compact development, we wanted to find out what's unemployment. Well, there's not really any data on unemployment, so we had to spend a lot of effort in. And many times I believe, and I'm biased, that the constraints, the binding constraints to economic growth are data, is a lack of data. So yes, we spend a lot of time and effort in making sure that we do have the right data validated by a third party, validated by us, because the countries are responsible for doing all that. Did I answer your question?
Yeah,
Sort of. Development is also messy. Democracy is very messy. And so this is not perfect science, but we try to interject analytics and make it a more rigorous process than normal. So, continuum of results. We look at policy performance to make sure that the country is committed to, like, say, if we're going into the power sector. There's a lot of talk during the African Leader Summit that happened earlier this year, where we understood in many of these countries in Africa, power or access to electricity is a major constraint. And so the power sector, it's not just going in to invest building generation or power generation, or building transmission or distribution. It is really important that they set the sector straight, the power sector. In order for the private sector to come into, say, Ghana, for example, the private sector said, we've discovered that there's about $8 billion of private sector-led investments that can go into Ghana should they fix the utility sector. So we spent a lot of effort making sure that policy performance, that they agreed to fix the policy problems before the investments, and what we call conditions precedent, CPs. In order for us to sign the compact, there's a whole bunch of CPs that they have to meet. Like the PPP law is one in El Salvador.
What kind of risk analysis do you do in support of your analysis or your decisions?
So we think that all of this is a risk analysis. because we have an investment risk officer. We're like an investment bank. We have to ensure that not only the programming side, but our oversight of that programming has also we do analysis around it to ensure that operationally, not only the planning wise, we do what we say we're going to do, but operationally we actually carry it out. So the investment risk officer spends a lot of time in the operational side of things to ensure that there is mitigating any of the risk. In any of these management decisions, what I call the IMC, the Investment Management Committee, when we go through all that, there's a huge section on risk, whether it's operational risk, completion risk, political risk. So it's a huge effort in terms of when we do these constraints analysis. Yes.
The World Bank has been pushing open data as a development tool, making decisions about investing in certain projects under the hope or expectation that opening up financial or government data will actually promote development as a tool. Is the promotion of open data within candidate countries something that the MCC considers when making investment decisions?
I'm not sure specifically about open data, but certainly open government. So we think that it goes a long ways when some of these countries fail in that control of corruption indicator. For example, last year, Benin, Sierra Leone failed in the control of corruption indicator. Did it again. One of the things that we asked them to look at is, you heard about the Open Government Partnership? One of the things that we asked them to is some of the things that we think they could do in order to achieve control of corruption, to pass control of corruption, is signing up for open government, committed to that open government plan that they say they're going to do, but also implementing an open government plan. Now, open data is part of that open government, but certainly there's a lot more than open government, to open government than open data. Allowing transparency in your decision-making process. Some countries actually do write their constitution through an open process. Like I think I can't remember which country it was. Egypt? No, I can't remember one of the countries. Anyway, does that answer your question? So going back to it, policy and institutional reforms. Then we focus on inputs, outputs, outcomes, and then ultimate impacts. What's very interesting is that MCC has been in existence for 10 years, as I mentioned. We have spent a lot of time, effort focusing on these three things. Mostly actually inputs and outputs. Some outcomes, when we build a road, how many kilometers are being built versus how many cars actually start using the road. I can tell you, from here to here, we hit the mark 90 to 99%. It's when it comes to the ultimate impacts and the impact evaluation is when there's still some questions about how effective and whether we've hit the mark or not.
It's only 10 years.
What's that?
It's not a long period of time.
It's not a long period of time, yes. You're right, exactly. So impact evaluation you should go back 5 to 10 years after the investment has occurred to actually see the results, right? So you're right. So hopefully, we pray that we have a better. But you know, you hit those marks. You assume that you will, but you don't know.
Do you take into consideration environmental impacts?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Environment is a big deal. Environment, labor, all of the IFC performance standards we take on. You know about the IFC performance standards. It's been, I think it's taken over decades where they have developed for World Bank projects, or at least their private sector projects, environmental impact, sustainability, but also labor issues, right?
I was just curious, did you find like a steep curve, a learning curve from the, you know, I don't think you were there when MCC first started, but did you have to develop new methodologies, or did you rely on World Bank existing ones and just improvised on it? What did,
It's a highly politically charged. If I were at MCC, I would probably answer it with a more political savvy answer. But MCC prides itself in invented here. Invented here. You know, they want to. They were created to look at aid differently.
Yeah.
Right? You remember more than 10 years ago, the Bush administration created MCC because they didn't believe that the aid that was going, whether it's the bank or anywhere else, going into these countries was having any effect or any impact.
That's
So
why I asked you about it.
they created MCC to be different.
Yeah.
And so we spent a lot of time, and I myself, because having spent a lot of years in other federal agencies, I actually spent some time, as Jeff said, I was at the Asian Development Bank. I also spent some time at the World Bank. So, like, you know, if it's ain't broke and it's working, let's figure out how we could use it. No, we got to do it ourselves. And we got to prove, and there's a lot of academics, a lot of PhDs at MCC, a lot of academics that want to do it, and they have to prove to themselves that it works. And it's not just okay that the World Bank has done it. So once a compact is signed, then we go into the by statute, each compact is only 5 years. There's no way you can extend it, no matter what happens. So for example, in Mongolia, we're building road, north-south road, by the way. And Mongolia, the construction season is only about 5 months out of the year. And all kinds of disasters, natural disasters occur. And if you miss that window, forget it. So we've been trying to go to Congress a couple times to say if for unmitigated circumstances like a disaster, a natural disaster, or any thing that is unforeseen, it's God, happens by hand of God, can we extend it for at least a year? The answer has always been no. The 5-year clock is very strict, and it drives all kinds of decisions, sometimes good, sometimes not so good, for MCC. So once a compact is signed, 5 years, by golly, we got to get it done. So some of that learning that you talked about early on in the MCC history, there was a lot of push to get the money out the door. There was a lot of criticism, I guess, when MCC was first created. I don't think they got the money out the door for 2 years. It was created in 2004, maybe 3 years, a little over 2 years. They didn't get the money out the door until, and Congress was giving money to MCC, and it was sitting, and by the way, it's still a problem. As the CFO, I was always very nervous that when I left, it was $2 billion in unobligated balances. In a time of budget constraints, that's a huge risk to the agency. You know, if you know that many of you are in the government agencies. Having $2 billion in unobligated balances, that's a scary thing. There it is.
Do you have know your money or?
Know your money. All know your money.
Okay.
Yeah, it's wild. Except that they want us to keep track of every dollar from each year. That's also been a financial management nightmare for me when I was there. But yeah, it's all X money, which is very big luxury in this case. But you have to spend it, right? So the problem is the upfront. You saw a lot of analysis that goes on once the board makes a decision. It takes sometimes we want it to be a little bit over 2 years. You know, that's the goal. But Ghana took 4 years. So for 4 years, it's been in the MCC CBJ. We're going to do Ghana. We're going to do Ghana. I promise, we're going to do Ghana. Oh, I think we're going to do Ghana, really. That's a very anxiety-driven. That's why I retired. Too much anxiety going up to the hill to explain. We're really going to spend the money. But once a compact is signed, we go into these what we call a program monitoring, and I don't know if you guys have heard about the science of delivery, Michael Barber and City Stat. No? Jeff, you want to
You want me to
indulge?
talk? I'll let you talk.
It is all about making sure you decide on a goal, and then you check in and you focus like a laser beam on that goal, and you check in on a regular basis, and you bring all the stakeholders that are involved in it around the table, around a room, and you just go through that goal over and over and over and over. CityStat, for example, in DC, I think Adrian Fenty started it here, and Baltimore has the same thing, by the way. And the World Bank is now actually taking on, Jim Kim has been focused on this whole science of delivery. But monitoring, make sure that you guys we're doing what we say we're doing. We collect the monitoring and evaluation, monitoring data, whether it's inputs, outputs, or outcomes. We're very focused on, are we delivering? Every quarter, we have what we call a QPR, a quarterly portfolio review, where management sit around with the team on each of the sectors, each of the projects. We go through, are you meeting the targets for this quarter? Are you spending the money? Not only the output dollars that are going out the door, but are you achieving the goal? Are you building the number of kilometers that you say you're building for that quarter? Are you giving compensation to people who resettlement compensations? So there's a lot of analytics and spreadsheets that goes on, and we look at it on a quarterly basis. What we call an indicator, performance indicator tracking table, and then we pull out key performance indicators every quarter to look at. So 5 years, there's 20 quarters. Thank God it's limited time. We look at it and we analyze. This is what we look at as a performance indicator. It's an indicator tracking table. So how many hectares of land has been irrigated? what's the baseline, what's cumulatively every quarter, we look at it, the target for each quarter, and then for the rest of the year, for 5 years. There's a lot of data. That's what's great about this organization, it's just a lot of data. Although, the problem is, with any organization, it's always in the S-Drive jail. I spent a lot of time at MCC trying to free it, to free that data out of the S-Drive jail.
Are you required to report under GIPRA? Government and
Yes,
results?
but so GIPRA, I would say MCC is a new generation of GIPRA, because if you look at this monitoring, we don't go out up front and do it for the whole agency very well. We do it by project, by country, by sector, and we spend a lot of time with these performance indicators. They go way beyond what GIPRA requires.
So not your own internal management?
Yeah, it's for internal management. Yeah. Say in Armenia, there's a rural project, that's an agriculture project. These are the projects. Each of the activities within the project gets broken down, and then we have indicators on success for each of the subsectors and the sub-activities of each. And we asked the MCAs. Let me backtrack a little bit. Once a compact before the compact is signed, we require that the countries create an institution, an organization, preferably outside of any of their ministries. It could be within the ministry, but it has to be insulated and isolated. It's kind of an implementation unit. They have to have a CEO, they have to have a CFO and a board of directors. They have to have a separate bank account, by the way. We don't flow that money through their Ministry of Finance or their treasury. It goes through the bank. And these organizations are called Millennium Challenge Accounts, MCAs. And those are that's the organization the MCC deals with, the MCA. And the MCAs are required to report this data on a quarterly basis. In order for them to get money, they have to report all that. So we get pretty good data, and we validate. We have our own independent engineers. So if they're building a road, to your point about is the data valid, we validate it. We send our folks out on a quarterly basis to make sure that whatever they're reporting is actually what's actually happening on the ground.
Another question. It sounds like a lot of this construction. Do you use EVMS
Yes.
as part of tracking?
Yes, we do. We use a lot of the international standards called FIDIC. Have you ever heard of FIDIC? It's an international standard for construction management. So you have a contractor, and then we require that the contractor have a supervising engineer to supervise the contractor, and then we have our own independent engineer that MCC hires to oversee the supervising engineer supervising the contractors. This is all international, mostly construction engineering contracting. So, let's see. We'll go again. Here we go. Plug in and plug again. Where's my mouse? Okay. This is what we report on our website, so it's a select part, it's every quarter we report on this. Finally, we do evaluation, and MCC is seen as a leader in the evaluation process. 100% of our portfolio is evaluated. 60% is done through what we call performance evaluation, and then 40% is impact evaluation. Of course, we do monitoring indicators 100% of the portfolio. For that, I think I was mentioning something about the getting money out the door as quickly as possible earlier. So in the early years, they were focused on getting the compact signed. And in 2007, there were 5 big compacts that signed, huge countries, $700 million to Mozambique, $700 million to Tanzania, 500 or 600 to Mongolia, Morocco. It was just huge effort, money out the door, and they signed the compact without having the due diligence and the backup information all done, and we spent a lot of time running in place to try and get done. So the 5-year clock is a real one, and if you don't complete anything within, or if you don't complete the road, for example, we take our money and we take it back. So, for example, in a couple of things in Ghana, it was very interesting. I just joined MCC. It was one of my first meetings with the CEO and senior staff, and basically the CEO said, "I don't care if every one of you take a shovel, go out there to Ghana, but we got to get this thing done." And so we got it done. It's called the George W. Bush Highway. And when the ribbon cutting for the George W. Bush Highway came along, there were probably thousands of people. There were probably about 5 deep on both sides of the road and people were out there waving American flags. Like, we love America, because this is the biggest symbol of American friendship. This road, where it used to take 4 hours, now takes 45 minutes. And my fellow VP who went to the ribbon cutting, on the way back, he sat in a plane next to this guy from Ghana. And the guy says, "Oh, you work at MCC? Oh, you don't know. Those guys been out there day and night. We don't have deadlines in Ghana, but gosh, there was a deadline and people were working day and night." So that 5-year clock actually is pretty critical. We don't want to change that 5-year clock, because it really drives drives us to the finish, but it also pushes a lot of getting it done, maybe not as solidly as we would have liked, but certainly it's huge impact. Last thing I want to talk a little bit about is the MCC effect. I know that one of the questions that Jeff asked me to think about, and I want to answer it before he asked me that question, is the MCC effect is big. William and Mary did a study, and I would urge you all to take a look at that study at William and Mary. That they surveyed 640 policy officials in these developing countries, and asked them which set of indicators or which data do you see as the most influential in your making your decisions in policy. And I want to try to pull this up, actually, if I have it. Here it is. So this is the report. It's called Measuring the Policy Influence of MCC, survey-based approach. Like I said, they surveyed 640 policy officials in country as to what is the most influential, what set the data. So we talked about the doing business report, the World Bank report. Let me show you this. It's really good read for those of you that are interested in analytics, right? But I'll show you this one chart that is really impactful. This is within MCC. Well, maybe I missed it. It's a very interesting chart where they looked at different data sets, different indicators, and maybe this is it. No, that's not it. I think this is it. Influence of external assessment of government performance. Of course, MCC is number one. But the United Nations Millennium Development Goals, by the way, we're resetting those in 2015. The IMF's country assessment of macroeconomic performance, the World Bank's doing business report, they were asked 3 questions. They were asked, name 3 reports that most influence your change behavior in what you do. MCC's eligibility criteria comes out number 1. So we call it the MCC effect. In many of these countries, even before they got to be eligible, they spent their own money to figure out how to influence the eligibility criteria. So for example, Sierra Leone and Liberia just did that 2 years ago. They spent 4 years fixing those indicators to make sure that they passed 10 of the 20 indicators, even before MCC spent a dime on it. And in terms of political influence, there's been asked about, what about going up to Congress? Well, several countries tried to do that. I think Guatemala tried to do that. They thought that they could go and talk to our appropriators to see if they could change mind. So this data is third-party data. We don't have control over this data. So there's no way we could, give any country a leg up unless they pass this scorecard. So many of these countries spend a lot of time with third-party data, with the third-party data suppliers to ensure that they can pass the selection. So with that, I'll open it up for more questions.
Let me ask one question on this, and then certainly anybody who would like to can. So what you're telling us essentially is that the MCC's criteria upon which it makes grants have been very impactful and have stuck in people's minds.
Mm-hmm.
Why? What is it that the folks in the room can learn about setting their own criteria and using data from how is it or why is it that MCC was so successful?
Well, I think it's because of the money that's tied to this.
So lots of money.
Lots of money. Free money. Supposedly free money.
So my theory goes a little beyond that, and let me ask this. I'm thinking it's because you don't use a lot of different measures, and because the measures are relatively intuitive. Low corruption, democracy. So you've kind of got like 3 measures, and they're pretty intuitive and easy to understand.
They're 20 measures.
And the threshold,
They're 20.
but they're in groups.
They're in groups, they have to pass 10 of the
Okay.
20. So there are 9, like Morocco and Liberia passed only 9 last year.
Okay.
And the board says, no. So they have to pass those 2 hard hurdles, control corruption and democratic governance, and then they have to pass 10.
So why are MCCs more influential than GAVs, which were at the bottom?
Is Gabby on the bottom?
It was.
Because, like I said, they. I think there's a video actually on MCC's website. The president of Tanzania, Kikwete, basically he says, look, and a lot of, I alluded to this a little bit, there's a lot of country ownership. You know, we ask the country to decide what sectors, we help them a little bit, we ask them to do the analysis. There's a lot of ownership in this process, and I think that helps a lot. That the data that, you know, we validate it, but they collect it, they generate it, they hire the economists, and there's a lot of skin in the game for them, and of course, large sum of money, and it becomes a big, you know, we bring either the president, I think President Bush went to Tanzania to sign the compact, Secretary Clinton went to Indonesia to sign the compact, so it's a huge deal, and it actually could make or break elections in many of these countries. If you don't, like Benin, for example, they didn't meet the control of corruption indicator last year after spending 2 years in developing that compact, and it became a huge political issue for the ruling party. So it gets very tied into the politics of the local, you know, of the country.
Drives decisions.
It
Good.
drives decisions.
What other questions do you all have?
Does the 700 million go out all at once, or do they have to pass certain gates along the way?
That's a good question. It used to be, this is another one of those lessons learned. It used to be when they first, well, the agency was created under very, you know, it's very idealistic. They think, we give the country a lot of money, they will never need aid again because it'll transform the country and the economy. Well, it hadn't turned out that way. So in the beginning, they say, oh, it's 5 years, 20 quarters, we're just gonna divide 700 million by 20 and push the money out the door. Well, in Tanzania, for example, they didn't get to a contract and start construction until 2.5 years into the compact. All that money was sitting in that bank account that I talked about in the country. Treasuries came knocking on our door. I'm sorry, we as the US Treasury Department will arbitrage on the dollar, not you, because we're collecting interest and we're paying back the US Treasury interest. That's not what they want to do. They don't want to borrow money from China so that you could put it into a bank account and collect interest coming back. So that's not the way Treasury works. So we pull back quite a bit. The current process, which is still a little, it makes it seem like if some of you are in a CFO role, will understand my problems with this process, because it's a grant. It's going to the country for them to do whatever they need to do. However, they've pulled back enough that the process is now we're only paying, we give them some money for their admin functions, but for big construction projects, we pay the contractors directly through Treasury. So the invoices come in, and our shared service provider is Department of Interior. Invoices come in, and then somebody types into the Treasury system, pay $2 million to this construction company and $5 million to that construction. That it drove me nuts. And I try to change that, but it's still the same process. It makes it look like we are, as the agency, federal agency, buying those services. In fact, we're not. It's a grant. But yes, we don't pay until the contractor submits an invoice on how much progress they've made on the ground. We do some advances, which also causes problems with financial management, where you have to understand where you liquidate those advances, which we have problems doing on a project by project basis.
Is there any evidence that MCC's data analytics approach has influenced the foreign assistance of other agencies who give it?
Lots. So the World Bank, you mentioned the World Bank. The World Bank, probably about 4 or 5 years ago, went through a board paper. It'd be interesting for you to take a look at. They call them P4 it's programming for results. P4R. So yes, and now USAID talks like that. It's all about results based. It's all about analytics. I think MCC's really led the way. Many, at least organizations that I know of, are talking the game and how much they're doing it. That follows our model. I think quite a few do that. Yes? You have a question?
I was thinking about what you just said about other organizations, internationally focused organizations, adopting this measurement analytical approach. I was just wondering, I wonder if this might work in the United States.
It's funny you ask. Did Kathy speak here?
Kathy
last time,
Stack did, yeah.
So this particular deck, versions of this, I provided at OMB to Kathy and to others at the Domestic Policy, based on our conversations. By the way, this deck helped get MCC $100 million in 2015 from out of OMB. So the question you asked me about budgeting for the countries, but it also helped MCC. It didn't help my $2 billion of unobligated balances. It made it more. But a lot of people, a lot of organizations like this. So I think Kathy has done a yeoman's job in terms of tying results to the funding, and she's trying it in I think the child nutrition, is it child nutrition?
Yeah, she spoke before.
Yeah. So they're trying it out in domestic programs, in the grant. Now, it's much more difficult in the domestic programs because they're so stovepipe, as she mentioned, right? And in order for you to really bring it all together, it's been a big challenge. But they're trying.
So Chantal, we have one question that's come in from someone watching via live stream, and after that we'll probably finish up to keep everything on time. Richard Robinson from the Telos Corporation says, from your analytics, which types of investments are the most impactful to MCC, and what correlation or causation have you learned from the analysis?
Well, I don't think it's the type of investment, but it's how you actually implement those investments. It could be a road, but if not implemented correctly, you didn't get the right. For example, I actually, one of my, I was the VP, as Jeff mentioned, I was the VP for admin and finance, so it really was in charge of the internal plumbing of the organization, and I didn't get a chance to go out very much. But the one country that I did go was Tanzania. And I got to ride on 2 roads that we built. So it's in that one particular sector. One was a French contractor. The other was a Chinese contractor. It was very interesting for me to see this stuff on the ground. The Chinese, they were very efficient. They just went like gangbusters. They paved the road, they, asphalt, the different pebbles, quarry. And they went and finished it in record time. But in the meantime, they forgot to put the drainage, but also they went through a village and cut off their water supply. So they were like, well, that's not good. The French, they went much slower. They went back a couple of times, back and forth. By the time they got to the end, they had to go back and fix the front because weather had occurred and whatnot. So a lot of it is not just what types of investments and what sectors, but really how do you actually impact it? How do you implement it? What are the systems and processes that you put in place? How do you help the countries to do it sustainably? In El Salvador, what we looked at was El Salvador too. In El Salvador 1, they had this implementation agency that they put together. Well, guess what? They found that this implementation agency was really good in implementing road construction. So they kept it going. Even though the compact was done, before the second compact came along, they kept that unit going to help that country, their own construction projects. So that's probably the goal of sustainability and investments, rather than what particular sectors.
Okay. So please join me in thanking Chantal Wong.
Thank you.
And we appreciate your service to the country and to the development community and to analytics.
Thank you.
Please join us on February 11th, I believe it is, for the next Government Analytics Breakfast. It'll be available again online and in person here. Thanks for coming.